have now expired. Convener, the measures in the bill fall into three broad categories: powers to counter future public health threats, the embedding of practical public service reforms that have demonstrated their value irrespective of the public health position, and extended to temporary measures to manage the impact of COVID specifically on the Scottish justice system. Provisions in the first two of these three categories are within the committee's scrutiny remit, and I have followed stakeholder evidence with interest. It has, of course, been put to ministers that it would have been better to have split the bill, and there's a good reason why the government was minded to progress with one single bill. For the most part, measures in the bill across all categories exist in temporary legislation now confirmed to expire in September. They all update and equip the statute book in sensible ways as part of learning lessons from the pandemic. They were all consulted on together as a coherent package in a full 12-week public consultation, which took place between August and November last year, and the measures in the bill collectively support the government's COVID recovery strategy and recent updated COVID strategic framework. In the particular case of public health protection proposals, it has been put to the government that these future powers are not needed now that Scotland is transitioning from baseline COVID requirements in law to guidance. I disagree. This brings into sharper focus the important distinction between having appropriate powers to hand to respond to future public health threats, which I consider to be in the public interest, and the difference of using them. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has taken a close interest in this bill and in its Stage 1 report, which was published on Tuesday. I will, of course, consider the detail of its recommendations closely, but I'm happy to signal, as I did when I appeared before it to give evidence, that I will look to work constructively with the committee on issues like the maid affirmative procedure, and I'm happy to consider where constructive improvements can be made to the proposals the government has put forward. And I look forward to the committee's questions.
The committee had submissions from Dr. Andrew Tickle and Professor Alison Britton, both from Glasgow Caledonian University, and they concluded that the main provision in Part 1 of the bill are generally in keeping with the law already applying in England and in Wales. But there was one concern regarding the power to modify and amend the enactment, which I think is known as the Henry VIII power. Can I ask how the public health powers in the bill compare to the equivalent powers in England and Wales, and also why the inclusion of the Henry VIII clause was thought necessary?
The provisions are broadly comparable to the provisions that are available in England and Wales, and these provisions have been in place, I think, if my memory serves me right, for the best part of a decade, or more than a decade. And essentially this gets to the nub of the bill, which is the necessity of ensuring that the legislative framework that we have in place is appropriate to deal with the emergence of a major national public health issue of the type of a pandemic. Now, if we look at the legislation that has been considered by Parliament in this respect in the past, we have the two Coronavirus Acts, where it is fair to say, taken through Parliament at great speed. There was significant parliamentary cooperation to enable that to be the case. But of course, the level of scrutiny that was available for those provisions at that time was very limited indeed. So what essentially we are doing in this bill is taking a calm period to consider with full parliamentary scrutiny the type of measures that could be put into place should we face a further pandemic, and to enable us to ensure that we have the necessary statutory force in place to provide for that. Obviously with sufficient parliamentary scrutiny about the government taking any steps within the framework of the legislation. So essentially, the point you make to me, convening the point that's been made by the legal academics, is that it's important that we have a structure of legislation in place to enable us to handle a future pandemic, but that we consider that in slow time to enable us to ensure that we have the right arrangements in place And as I indicated earlier in my answer, those provisions are broadly comparable to the provisions that are available in England and Wales.
Thank you, Deputy. Ask, why are the current procedural rules allowing for emergency bills to be progressed through the Parliament thought to be inadequate in these circumstances?
I think, again, this is an issue which I think is at the heart of the discussion around this bill, and it's a question of whether we think it's appropriate to put in place legislative change at very fast pace when a pandemic scenario arises. And that was what Parliament had to do on two occasions in the spring of 2020. The legislation was handled in a very swift timescale. In a matter of days, very complex legislation was put forward. And what the government has reflected on as a lesson to learn from the pandemic is, and this is a point that I think has also been made to the committee by legal academics, there is a well expressed view from the World Health Organization that countries should have in place appropriate measures and mechanisms to enable them to respond swiftly and appropriately to a pandemic. And therefore, the opportunity is there for us to consider in slower time what that range of powers could look like and could be enacted should we face that situation. So essentially, the nub of the consideration of the principle of this bill, from my perspective, particularly around about the early parts of the bill, are about ensuring that we have a legislative framework in place that enables us to think in advance about what might be the type of legislative changes we may need to make and how we can make those. And that is essentially what the bill proposes to do.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. I'll move on to members now. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Deputy First Minister, and I hope you are feeling a bit better. I want to ask some questions around the exercise of ministerial powers. But before I do that, seeing as you referenced earlier in your comments the issue of public consultation, it is fair to say that the government, when they ran their own consultation on this, found a wide degree of public concern and opposition to what is being proposed. The committee ran its own survey with the public with a call for views. We received just short of 4,000 responses from the public, of which 90% were in opposition to the bill, with people expressing concerns about the impact on personal liberty and the lack of parliamentary scrutiny over what's proposed. I can't remember in 2 decades a piece of legislation in this Parliament attracting that level of public concern. Can you?
I suspect there have been other pieces of legislation that have attracted public concern. Yes, I suspect also the degree of public concern may have had something to do with the way in which some members of Parliament characterised the legislation, and I'm sure Mr Fraser knows the point I'm making in that remark. So I think what's important is that members of Parliament concentrate in their deliberations on the substance of the issue. And the substance of the issue for me is, do we have the right legislative framework in place to deal with the possibility of a pandemic? Clearly, we didn't have in March 2020 because we had to rush through 2 pieces of legislation in a matter of days to provide the legislative force to handle the pandemic. So clearly our statute book was not sufficient or not appropriate in March 2020 to deal with the circumstances that we faced. So what the government is now doing is learning a lesson from that experience and putting in place legislation which we consider to be proportionate and appropriate for those circumstances, only to be used in those circumstances in terms of the public health provisions. and for there to be appropriate and effective parliamentary scrutiny of the exercise of those functions by the government. And that's the justification for the bill, and why I think obviously in that wider appreciation of it would be clearly understood by members of the public.
Thank you for that response. So this issue of the level of parliamentary scrutiny and ministerial accountability goes to the heart of our scrutiny of the bill. So can I follow up, firstly, the line of questioning from the convener around the use of Henry VIII powers that are contained in this bill? And Professor Britton and Dr. Tickell, in their evidence to this committee, said that this was a highly problematic element that had not been adequately explained or justified by the Scottish Government, that the lack of comment in the policy memorandum on this was remarkable, and that this aspect of the proposals required clear justification and anxious scrutiny. So can I ask you, why do you think it's appropriate for ministers to have these sweeping Henry VIII powers when we do have a clear alternative route, which is the use of emergency legislation, which, as you have already accepted, was used to put through the coronavirus legislation very quickly when it was required 2 years ago?
I think the difficulty with I think it depends which way we look at these questions. Do we look at the experience of the pandemic and think there are no lessons to be learned, and that we should be quite happy to put through significant elements of primary legislation in a matter of days? On other occasions, members of Parliament would rail against significant changes in primary legislation in a matter of days. And I think generally, in my experience in Parliament, that would be viewed not to be a desirable approach to take. So now, nobody foresaw the pandemic coming, although we had enough awareness that there was the likelihood of some form of pandemic coming. But it didn't prompt us to review our statute book. We've had the pandemic, we're still going through it, believe you me, some of us are still going through it. And we are now trying to adapt the statute book to learn the lessons from that, so that we can put in place proportionate powers that can be scrutinised by Parliament in a normal legislative process, which is what we're going through just now, and Parliament can decide if it wishes to change its statute book to enable these provisions. So that's the type of thinking that has gone into this legislation to make sure that we're not having to rush significant primary legislation through Parliament in a matter of days. We take stock, we'll learn the lessons from the pandemic, and we put in place powers with sufficient parliamentary scrutiny that enable us to act accordingly when a situation arises.
Okay, thank you. We're trying to pursue parliamentary scrutiny now. Professor Britton and Dr. Tickell said there was no explanation or justification of the provision for Henry VIII powers, and the policy memorandum provided no justification for it. So can you tell us, in the absence of a policy memorandum explanation, why these Henry VIII powers are required?
Well, the power has been included to address potential situations where regulations are needed to respond to a public health threat that might conflict with existing legislation. So that's the justification for this. However, as with all regulations made under the legislation that was put in place, it could only be used where it was necessary to respond to a threat posed through a significant risk to public health by the pandemic. So there are very significant regulatory constraints and limits in place around what the government would be able to do. But fundamentally, there would have to be a significant risk to public health to justify the use of any of these powers. So that's the rationale for why those powers are in place. To have that, essentially, that trigger mechanism of the threat to public health, and then the possibility that there may be a conflict with existing legislation that needs to be resolved.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on a little bit and ask you about the made affirmative procedure. You'll know that the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has commented on this, and in evidence to us, Professor De Londres said that the made affirmative procedure is inherently problematic and should only be employed in exceptional circumstances. And she suggested in her evidence that if regulations were made under Part 1, under the made affirmative procedure, a ministerial statement of the reasons for using that procedure, explaining the alleged urgency, should be provided. So would you accept that as a proposal for a way forward?
I think there's a lot in this area that we need to look at further. I welcome the report from the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. I think I had a very thoughtful discussion with the committee when I appeared there a few weeks ago. The committee, I think quite pragmatically, was understanding of the challenge for the government that the made affirmative procedure generally takes about 40 days. The made affirmative procedure is obviously, it can be utilised with greater urgency, subject to parliamentary scrutiny at a later stage, or parliamentary consent at a later stage. So between those, and the committee was exploring, is there some other approach we could take, which might be a halfway house or a partway house within all of that. And I'm very happy to explore that. I think the point that Mr. Fraser made to me, I didn't quite catch the academic's name that Mr. Fraser raised with me, but I think Professor De Londres, yeah. Thank you. Professor De Londres' suggestion, I think, is again